Welcome to Mind Crime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we are joined by Dr. Walter Block to discuss his work on reparations. Tim.
So the first question, Walter, in brief, why do you think some form of reparations is justified? Why do you think it is in general justified, as well as more precisely in libertarianism, in the sort of Rothbardian libertarianism that you represent?
Well, Swithin has got a nice brown shirt there, I see. And it just so happens that my great-grandfather stole it from his great-grandfather. No, wait. His great-grandfather stole it from my great-grandfather. That's my shirt. Give it back to me, Swithin, you dirty rat, you. The essence of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle and private property rights. Nobody should steal anything from anyone. So, Tim, if I now steal your hat, I see a red hat behind you to your right. I steal your red hat, and now I'm wearing your red hat. Well, I should go to jail for stealing it, but what should happen to that red hat? The red hat should go back to you. Surely the first part of punishment is the guy who stole the red hat should return the red hat. I think libertarian punishment theory would do a lot more to me than just returning your red hat. It would put me in jail, whatever. But at least I have to return your red hat. Now, Swithin's great-grandfather stole that shirt from my great-grandfather. Or maybe from my grandfather, because I'm a generation older than Swithin. And just as I, the thief, had to return your red hat to you, Swithin should have to return that nice brown sweater to me. Because it's too late for great-grandfathers. They're all dead. But what happened, Swithin's great-grandfather gave it to his grandfather, who gave it to his father, who gave it to Swithin. Now, the libertarian essence is time is irrelevant. Well, time, there's no statute of limitations. Well, let me rephrase that. There is a statute of limitations, but it's a natural one. Namely, the further back in history you go, the harder it is to prove anything. And possession is 9/10 of the law. So Swithin now has that brown sweater, and he's possessing it. So the burden of proof is on me to prove. But I have a picture of my great-grandfather wearing that sweater, and I can prove it. So therefore, the statute of limitations shouldn't operate, and Swithin should give me that brown shirt, that brown sweater. So to me, the reparations is just part of returning stolen property.
So, second question we had was... So,
I'm not taking any questions from Swithin until he gives me that shirt. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Go for it. So, taking antebellum slavery, who in general would be entitled to reparations? Would it just be descendants of black slaves? Or are there other descendants of people who, in your view, would be legitimately entitled to forms of reparations?
Well, the way the black people, black studies people, and the people who favor reparations, the way they look at it, all whites owe all blacks a reparations for slavery. And I think that that's problematic, highly problematic. I think that's incorrect, certainly incompatible with libertarianism, because there were many whites who are now in the U.S. whose grandparents were not in the U.S. in 1865. They just came from, I don't know, Hungary or England or somewhere. What do they owe anyone for slavery? My grandparents, I'm Jewish, came to this country in 1895 or so. Maybe a little later, maybe 1905. They had nothing to do with slavery, so why do I owe anyone anything for slavery? And on the other hand, there are black people who just immigrated to the U.S., well, not just recently because of the pandemic, but a year ago. They came from Ghana, and their grandparents weren't slaves in the U.S. So I think I totally reject the idea that all whites owe all blacks anything. What should have happened in 1865 when slavery ended was the people who were slave masters should have been put in jail for kidnapping. Well, much worse than kidnapping. Aggravated kidnapping. I guess that's what slavery is. And all their property should have been taken away from them and given to the slaves. Instead, what they did is they gave it to their children, who gave it to their children. And now there's some white person who has got a plantation in Louisiana or South Carolina, and he's the owner of it. Okay, possession is 9/10 of the law. Some black guy who lives in Harlem in New York City, if he can prove that his great-grandfather was on that plantation, and let's say there were 50 slaves on that plantation, and he can prove that there were 50 slaves and that his great-grandfather was one of them, he should be able to go to court and say, hey, I own 1/50th of that plantation. So it would be very, very narrow and very specific. It wouldn't be all blacks and all whites. The only whites who are guilty of, well, the white grandchild isn't guilty of any crime. He didn't have slaves, but he's guilty of holding stolen property. Just as you, Swithin, were guilty of holding stolen property, the brown sweater that you've got, just as I was guilty of taking Tim's red hat. Namely, the essence of libertarianism is to return stolen property. The burden of proof is on he who would try to change things, because possession is 9/10 of the law. But I think that there is a case to be made that a few black people living now can prove that their great-grandfather or grandmother was a slave, and they should have 1/n, where n is the number of slaves. If there were 50 slaves, they should have 1/50th of the entire plantation. And if the plantation is, I don't know, 5,000 acres, they should have, what would that be, 100 acres or something like that? So I think that that's totally justified. Now, I had a debate with David Horowitz. And David Horowitz was magnificent in refuting the idea that all whites owe all blacks anything. But he couldn't refute this. What he said was it was sort of silly. Well, I don't know why it's silly to return stolen property that never should have been given to the white children in 1865. Doesn't seem silly to me. It doesn't seem theoretical. It seems practical. Well, theoretical also, but certainly practical. So my answer is yes, there are some black people who are the legitimate owners of plantations that should have gone to their grandfathers, great-grandfathers, but didn't. And they should be given those lands or properties or values or whatever.
So with the descendants, how closely related would you have to be to have a legitimate claim? Because I could see the arguments that, well, I maybe not be the direct descendant of a slave who was there, but I'm sort of the third cousin twice removed, or I'm not very good on family trees as to what the actual appropriate terms are.
I hear you. That's a good point. You're the grand-nephew, the grandson, or the grandnephew twice removed, or the second cousin, or who knows what. Well, libertarianism really has no answer to that question. This is what I call a continuum problem. What's a continuum problem? A continuum problem is we know that if you go to bed with a 5-year-old girl, you are a statutory rapist, even if she agrees, because we don't think she's capable of agreeing to any such thing. On the other hand, you go to bed with a 25-year-old woman, and she agrees, well, you're not a statutory rapist because we think she's perfectly capable of making that decision. Well, where do you draw the line? Is it 15, 14, 16, 17? I say it's 15 years old in 6 months. Well, why not 15 years old in 5 months or 15-year-olds in 7 months? You can't draw a line. Right now, I'm going to punch you, Swithin. And if you see my picture, you could see that I'm now pushing my fist toward your nose because you're a thief. That's it, just like you did. Because I want that brown shirt, the brown sweater that you've got. Well, are you entitled to use physical violence against me for pushing my fist in your direction? You're in England, I'm in New Orleans. That's silly. But as I get closer and closer to you, and if we didn't have a relationship where you knew that if I pushed my fist toward you, I certainly wouldn't impact it. It would just be, for purposes of education or illustration. But as I get closer and closer, you have more and more of a right to shoot me in the act of initiating force against you. Where do you draw the line? I don't know. So to answer your question about nephews or nieces or second cousins 3 times removed, I don't know. And there is no one who knows. There's no political philosophy, including libertarianism, who can solve the continuum problem. So I would say, well, if it's a grandson, yes, because I'm assuming that grandparents leave their wealth to grandchildren through the intermediation of their son or the father of the grandson. And maybe I could go along with a nephew or a first cousin. Maybe not the third cousin. Maybe the second cousin is the right place to stop. I don't know. Nobody knows. All I can say is we should have a court, a private court. I'm an anarchist. I'm not a government advocate. But even if we had government, if we had governments, we have governments. And a court should decide that. They should say, well, third cousins is too far away. First cousins is close enough. And maybe that would be the place to break it up, to have the continuum broken at that point.
Moving on, don't we have an original sin problem with property and reparations in general, which puts a huge favor on the status quo? Let's just take any piece of property. Any plantation in the South, or even in the American West. They might say many whatever you want to call them, the Indians might claim they actually own it. So if you give it back to the slaves, but then we discover that another competing group comes around and says, no, these actually own it. These plantations have been here for 300 years or 500 years in some cases, depending on when you want to start the clock on homesteading. In the same way I noticed on your debate over whether or not it was yours or someone else's on Israel, one was claiming that Rome 2,000 years ago stole a bunch of wealth from Israel, so therefore they should take the Colosseum back, have money back from the Colosseum. Isn't there just a collection of illegitimately and legitimately owned property, and we should just call it quits and just say status quo? Why shouldn't we just stick with that?
Well, what you're doing is a very, very important query, a very important objection. There are 2 or 3 cases you've given. One is the Indians, another is the Jews, another is the Romans. Let me answer all of them. First, the Indians. One objection to my theory, and this isn't original with me, this is, I regard it as black letter libertarianism, that we should have reparations if you can prove that there was theft and we have the rightful owner right there. How many people are right now in the United States? About 340 million, give or take?
Yeah,
and yet
about that.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
About that, maybe 330 million. The place is empty. If you ever take a plane east of the Mississippi, yeah, there are lights here and there are cities, but there are vast areas that are pretty empty east of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi, there's no one there. There's Denver. And maybe Salt Lake City, but that's it. There's nobody west of the Mississippi. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. How many Indians were there when the white man came? The best estimate is 2 million. 2 million? I mean, if 340 million can't fill up the place, 2 million can't fill up the place. So yes, if an Indian can prove that, another problem is the Indians go further back than the slaves, black slaves. And another problem is that there was writing during in mid-19th century, whereas the Indians didn't have written records. So it's much, much harder to prove that any Indian owns anything. So let alone, we have to give back the whole place to Indians. That's crazy. Do we have to give anything back to any Indians? Well, maybe. I'm open on that. Let them prove that they had certain property. Now, there are other cases where they were given a reservation, and then gold or oil or something was discovered on the reservation, and they kicked them out of there. Well, now we have records, and yes, they should be given their reservation. If you're a monarchist, if you believe in government, and government had a contract with them, a treaty with them, and they put them somewhere in the middle of North Dakota, and then they kicked them out of there, okay, the Indians own that. On the other hand, right now, the only people that can set up, gambling establishments are Indians. I don't see why I don't see the justification for that. I think anyone should be able to set up a gambling establishment. So to the objection that the Indians would own the whole country, I reject that. They wouldn't own the whole country. The question is, would they own anything more than they now own, apart from the reservations that they were kicked out? I don't know. I'm not sure. They were nomadic, although I have a co-authored article with an Indian, a person from the Homa tribe, and he says that they did have agriculture. It wasn't just that they had a southern place, 10 square miles, and they would hunt here and there. Oh, and another way that the continuum problem arises is how intensively do you have to homestead the land in order to own it? Do you have to put a corn plant every square foot, every square yard, every acre? What? And there has to be some sort of solution to that continuum problem. So what I'm saying is that the Indians didn't really intensively use that land that much. They had a southern area, and then they would go north for the summer, and then back down south for the winter. So they owned 10 square miles up in Montana, and then 10 square miles somewhere in Arizona, and the path back and forth, plus some agriculture that they did have. They would have very little. Okay, now for the Jews. I am on record in several publications with two co-authors, Rafi Farber and Alan Fruneman, and we claim that, yes, there are records from 2,000 years ago where Jews were in the disputed lands, and they were there way before the Palestinians. What happened was that the Jews set up a much more commercially viable place, and then the Palestinians came there after the Jews were there, very similar to what happened in South Africa. What happened in South Africa is there were no blacks in South Africa. Then the whites came. And when I say no blacks, I mean, very, very few blacks in South Africa. Then the Boers and the people from England and people from, where is it? Where did the Boers come from? Holland. Yeah. And they came and they set up a commercial, viable commercial activity, and then the blacks came there. So the whites were the proper owners of that land. And the same thing happened in the case with Israel and Palestine. That the Jews were there first, and the disputed lands where the Palestinians left in 1948. Well, if you just look at 48, then it looks pretty good for the Palestinians. And if you look at 1870, it looks pretty good. But if you look 2,000 years ago, for which we have records, it doesn't look all that good for the Palestinian land titles. The Jewish ones are much better. And now let's go back to the Roman era. Yeah, the Romans were a bunch of bad guys, and they have a Colosseum, and anyone who can prove that they own part of that Colosseum should be able to get part of that Colosseum. The point is, the further back you go in history, we have a natural statute of limitations, namely the further back you go, the harder it is to prove anything. So I think the Colosseum is pretty safe. I think the whites are pretty safe from the Indian claim of everything. And I think whites are pretty safe with regard to slavery with blacks, because only a few slaves descendants of slaves can prove anything.
I don't know if you ever visited the William Penn estate. He's the founder of Pennsylvania. But when I went there, I sort of checked up on the story, and I think it's basically true. It turns out that William Penn I sort of in my head generated thought that William Penn or some Pennsylvanians might be owed a claim from the natives. And the reason I say this is when William Penn arrived in Pennsylvania, he was a good Quaker, he was a Christian, he wanted to keep on good terms with the natives. He didn't have to. He was granted the land from the king in the king's eyes, so he didn't have to. But he traded valuable tools and for land. And if you calculate how much it costs to ship iron tools from England, this is not a small cost. So One of the first questions is, if you were the natives, this is a no-brainer deal. You get these great iron tools, and your hunting grounds are fairly super abundant. Why not give a few hundred acres for William Penn and his band of followers to set up a small community? This seems like a no-brainer. Would William Penn be owed this? Would William Penn be owed a claim? And inside of this, I think, is the idea that, did the natives actually own that piece of land that was sold? There's sort of inside of that question. Would there be claims going the opposite way?
Very, very good question. My understanding is that the island of Manhattan, which is worth a lot of money nowadays, was purchased from Indians for $25 worth of beads or something like that. And one question is, did the whites get cheated? Because maybe the Indians didn't own the whole of Manhattan. So maybe the whites were cheated here. And then you say, well, William Penn was given a grant by the king or some king or other. Well, we libertarians don't recognize that. We only recognize the John Lockean, Murray Rothbardian, Hans Hoppian notion of mixing your labor with the land and homesteading it, and that's the way you get to own it. So what the king said, the king of, I don't know, king of England or whoever he was, we libertarians don't have to recognize his grant to William Penn for anything. Secondly, he gave the Indians tools. Maybe he got cheated. Maybe they didn't really own that land because they didn't homestead it intensively enough. And I don't know where the cutoff is on how intensively you have to homestead, but the Indians didn't homestead it as intensively as the white people did. So assuming that the Indians owned it and they traded it for a bunch of tools, yeah, well, then William Penn is the rightful owner. But not of all of Pennsylvania. I mean, Pennsylvania is a big place. I don't know how many square miles they got, a ton of square miles. And how many William Penn people were there? A couple of hundred? Well, you know, Pennsylvania's got, I don't know how many millions of people now, and the place is still empty except for Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. No one there in the middle. I'm exaggerating a little bit. So how much land could 200 or 300 people own? Not all that much. Murray Rothbard once calculated that eastern Mississippi, his prudential judgment as to what the rate of homesteading would be, what was it? I forget, 160 acres for a family of 4. Because he figured that each person would need 40 acres to keep going and could homestead 40 acres, or a family of 4, mother and father and little kids. The father would do all the homesteading, but he could homestead 160 acres and not much more, and he could do 160 acres. So Murray's estimate of the fairness would be 160 acres for a family of 4, or 40 acres per person. And if there are, 300 Quakers, well, that's 1,200 acres, and that's it. And Pennsylvania is a lot bigger than, or is it 12,000 acres? It's a lot bigger than that.
A related question with respect to the Quakers or other sort of Christian groups. Suppose it was the case, I don't know the history that well, that basically it was practically impossible to manumit a slave. And if it was the case that a slave owner was to buy out slaves from other slave owners on the basis that they would be ill-treated and he would treat them significantly better, basically like a servant, he wouldn't beat them, he would be a good slave master, but of course he wouldn't allow them to be able to leave. If you were a descendant of that slave owner, would your position be any different than if you were the descendant of the somewhat more unpleasant one? And specifically that slave owner was somebody who bought your fourth arbor on the basis that he was being ill-treated elsewhere, and so he was kind of like a mercy of some description by buying him off somebody else.
Well, that's a very good question, and I confess I've written a lot about it, but I never thought about that. So I thank you for bringing this up. I never really thought about that. Let's forget about slavery for the moment, and I'm going to kidnap the 2 of you guys. And I'm a kidnapper. But Swithin, I treat you nastily because you have that brown sweater, and I beat you every day. Whereas Tim, I only beat you once a month, because you're my house slave and Swithin is my field slave, and I'm much nicer to Tim than I am to Swithin. And now I'm caught, and now I'm in the dock, and now I'm going to be sentenced. Well, it seems to me that I enslave both of you, so I go so high on the punishment meter. But then I'm punished a lot more for my dealing with Swithin than I am for Tim, because I was much more vicious to Swithin. But how much property do you get? Let's say you are my only two slaves. Should you get Swithin 2/3 of the land and Tim only 1/3? Because let's say I treated you twice as harshly or something like that. I'd have to think about that because I never thought about it. But my initial thought is you were both slaves, and you should each get half of the property. Let's say I only had the two of you as slaves, and I should. My initial thought would be that you should each get half, but I could be pushed out of that. I'd have to think about that. But let's say that now let's break it down. Mr. A had only Swithin as a slave, and Mr. B had Tim as a slave, and Mr. A was very nasty. Well, he should maybe be executed with a little torture in there. Whereas Mr. B, who was Tim's slave master, should only get life imprisonment or a clean, execution or something like that. Namely, the punishment should fit the crime. And the slave master A, who is Swithin's slave owner, was really nasty, and he should pay a severe penalty. And Tim's slave master, he manumitted him. Namely, he took him away from Tim's slave owner, and he treated him much nicer. So he's still a slave master, but the court should take that into account. Namely, that he was a nice guy, and he saved Tim from what happened to Swithin. But as to who owns how much property, I still think it should be equal. But again, I say I haven't thought about that, and let me think about that. But that would be my first thought about that.
As to a follow-up of this, how much would the slaves be owed? Because if you give them a piece of land back, to a certain extent, much of this land is probably useless now. A lot of plantations in the South are museums, or they're developments, or just giving them a piece of land back. And second of all, do they get to pick when they get the land back? So you have a spot of land. 40 years ago, a lot of land in certain areas was worthless. Now we discovered oil or natural gas underneath. Now all of a sudden, this land is very expensive to buy. So what do you think would be the settlement for the individual person there? Would it just be take the whatever piece of land divided by market rates? But if you get a bunch of claimants, that's going to drive the price way up. Or way down, possibly, depending on what your supply and demand there. What would be the dollar sign if you could come up with an estimate?
Well, this is a very tough question, because suppose that some black guy in Harlem says and could prove that he owns 1/50th of a plantation in I don't know, Mississippi. Well, which 50th? I think the fairest way is to say, and some of the acreage is right near the railroad or near the land, and it's worth a lot, and some of it is interior and you can't even get to it, and it's worth very little. I would say you take the average price of all the land, and you don't have to give them the land. You could give them the money. Namely, let's say that the plantation is worth $1 million, and he owns 1/10 of it. There were 10 slaves. Well, you could give him 100,000. Namely, the grandson should give 100,000. Now, it's not just land, but the slaves did improve it. They put in fertilizer. They built barns and stuff like that. So you have to, when we talk about land, we're talking about buildings also. On the other hand, the white grandchild put in his own buildings and his own improvements, and the slave shouldn't get the value of that because the grandson is an innocent person. He is just holding stolen property inadvertently and not knowingly. So he's not a criminal. So I would say the fairest thing to do is to give an average acre or an average 40 acres. You know, during 1865, there was this expression, 40 acres and a mule for each slave. Well, 40 acres and a mule is very similar to what Murray Rothbard said about 160 acres for a family of 4. And you toss in a mule because, you know, not only did the slaves work the land, but they worked the mules also. And if it's a cow and not a mule, you know, we're not going to really fight over that. And if the cow is no longer there, you can estimate the value of the cow. And now there are other complications. Well, what interest rate do you use for, you know, stuff from 150 years ago? Do you accrue the interest? These are very, very difficult problems that really don't go to the essence of the issue. I think the essence of the issue is, are reparations justified? And my answer is yes, they're justified. And, you know, how much the reparations will be and you know, which acre is going to be, those are sort of marginal issues that I confess I never wrote about it. I must have written 5 or 6 articles about this. Where were you guys when I needed you when I was writing this stuff? So you're asking very good and very important questions, but that's more for lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. I'm more of a libertarian theoretician. So I can just paint in broad brush strokes and give the overall analysis of it. I really can't do these very, very fine points. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. You guys have thought more about it than I have. You guys should write about it. If you agree with my overall assessment, that would be a good way to fill in what I left open, in effect.
Just to clarify, are the descendants of the slaves, are they entitled to the physical property that was left by the slaveholder, or are they entitled to the value of it? Because I wasn't entirely sure where you were going with the land and the acreage and who got it. Was the monetary value just because you couldn't assign who would get the right piece of land, or are they entitled to value of some description rather than just physical property?
I co-authored an article with a friend of mine, Hans Hoppe, and we said that you can only own physical property. You can't own the value of property, because the value of property is determined by supply and demand, as Tim was mentioning. And, you know, that brown sweater that you're wearing, I own it. And at one time it was worth $500, and now it's worth $5, or now it's worth $500 and it was once $5 or $500. Irrelevant. I own the sweater, whatever, or I own 1/10 of the sweater, and we have to figure out which 10th do I get. Do I get the sleeve or the, you know, the front of it, the back of it? I would get maybe the value of it, but I can't own I can't own the value of anything. I can't own the value of my house. Because if I own the value of my house, you are obliged to pay me a certain value for my house, and you don't want to pay it. Whereas if I own the house itself, then you are obliged to keep your mitts off the house unless with my permission. So my answer to that is we only own physical things. We don't own reputations, which leads to libel laws, or not libel laws, because we don't own our reputations. We don't own anything of value, or we don't own the value of anything. We only own the physical thing. So when we're talking about reparations, we're talking just about land. Now, some slaves are going to be lucky because they found oil on the plantation, or they found gold, or whatever it was. Other slaves are going to be very unlucky because at one time it was fertile, and now this area in Alabama is not fertile, and the land isn't worth that much. Too bad. Tough luck on you, grandchild of slaves. You only own 1/10 of that plantation, and if the plantation isn't worth much, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. I mean, I'm sorry to be so callous about that, but I'm trying to apply libertarian principle.
Are reparations a wrong against the current owners of the land or property? The elephant in the room currently, any reparations programs, is the state. You know, you go back to U.S. Civil War history, it's quite clear why it never wasn't a mule and 40 acres or whatever it was the state. State didn't have much interest in doing that. The state had a very interest in doing the opposite of that. But that's more about Civil War history. But isn't this currently any reparations program is just going to involve the state? And don't you, to a certain extent, feel somewhat weird about advocating for the state to come in and do this, or do you do this just because it's the truth? Like, what's your view on that?
You guys ask nasty questions. Well, look, I'm an anarchist. I believe that the one thing that the state should do is disband. But I can also take a minarchist point of view. I mean, most libertarians are not anarcho-capitalists. They're minarchists. We should have a very limited government, and we should have government courts and government police. So, I like to deal only with one problem at a time. And whenever I deal with problem A, I assume that problem B through Z is solved. And then when I deal with problem B, I assume that A and C through Z are solved. So here we are only talking about reparations. And whoever the forces of law and order are doing, if we're only, putting the horses, what do horses wear on the side of their face to keep them?
Blinkers.
Blinkers, right. So I'm putting the blinkers on, and I'm just looking at reparations. But, we can look at two problems at once, and I would be very loath to unleash the government to do anything because they'll probably screw it up. On the other hand, if there were any justice, look, there is even as an anarchist, when a government cop stops a murder or a government cop stops a rape, I say the cop did something good. It's true the way he was financed was not good, but he did something good. He stopped a murder or a rape. So I would say a similar sort of a thing here, that if the government, which I detest as an anarchist, if the government did something right here and allowed black people nowadays to try to prove that their grandfather was a slave on the XYZ plantation and therefore should get 1/10 of that land and 1/10 of the buildings or whatever it is, well, I would say that what the government did was just. The way the government was financed was not just, through compulsory taxes, but that act, if you can abstract from everything else, was just. So I'm not calling on the government to do anything. I'm not calling on the government cops to stop rapes and to stop murders. I'm very ambivalent about that because on the one hand, the government cops are evil because they're financed that way. On the other hand, most of what they do is stop victimless crimes. But every once in a while, they stop a real crime. And I have to acknowledge that is virtuous if we can abstract. And I don't see why we can't abstract, hold other things constant. The can opener joke in economics? A physicist and a chemist and an economist were all marooned on an island that had cans of food but no can opener. And the physicist said, let's drop the can from a certain height and it'll break on a rock and we'll open it, we'll eat the food. The chemist said, yeah, that's pretty good, but we can do better. We'll heat it up, certain temperature and pressure, and we'll have warm food. They turn to the economist and say, how can you help in our deliberations? And he says, assume a can opener. Well, we have to assume things as economists because we don't have controlled experiments. And I'm a libertarian economist, so I'm busily assuming all sorts of things. So I'm assuming no government. And what should the private defense agencies do? They should uphold reparations. Now let's assume a government. What should they do? Well, they should disband. But if they're not going to disband, the question is, should they stop murders or not stop murders? And I say, yes, better that they stop murders. Although even there, you could have a pragmatic, a utilitarian argument that if they do good things, then people will support them, and maybe they shouldn't stop murders. Namely, they should become inefficient in every way, not just 95%, but in every way so that we'll overturn them. So that's a pragmatic issue. But from a deontological point of view, yes, they should stop murders. And yes, they should uphold reparations claims if they're proven.
As a follow-up question, how much of the problems of reparations, partly identified here in this episode, is due to problems of homesteading? I think the first time I heard about you and your little debate with the YouTuber Sam Cedar, and when I listen to a lot of people who advocate reparations, I'm not really sure how they're justifying it because they're sort of flaky when it comes to ownership theories. They like to poke holes in libertarian ownership theories, all sort of kind of things. And I sort of touched on this. Can you sell something you don't own? How much of the problems or features of libertarian reparations is due to problems or features in libertarian homesteading theory itself? Like, how much do you have to homestead? Can you homestead an empty field or something like that?
Well, I don't think any of the problems of reparations come from libertarian theory. I think libertarian theory is the cat's pajamas. I think libertarian theory is great. Yes, there are continuum problems, but there are continuum problems in everything. Another joke, the economist was asked, how is your wife? The answer was, compared to what? Okay, libertarianism has the continuum problem. Every other political philosophy has the continuum problem. So we're no worse off than them, and we're better at everything else. So I make no apology for libertarian theory just because it can't solve the continuum problem. The impetus for reparations theory comes from Black Lives Matter's folk and from progressives who think that this is a way to help black people. I once got into an argument with Milton Friedman about reparations, and he said something interesting. He said, look, land is only about 10% of the GDP. So forget about reparations. We were talking about Brazil or South America. He says, forget about reparations. Let's focus on the more important things. How do you fix up Brazil? How do you fix up Chile, Argentina, Venezuela, all those countries? Have free enterprise. And I said, yes, Milton. I don't disagree. But as a matter of justice, shouldn't we also have reparations? And he said, what is it? Something like the road to hell is paved with cries for justice, and I hate justice, or something like that. I forget exactly what he said. I agree with Milton on this. The reparations is not a really important issue. The way to solve the block problem is first get rid of the minimum wage law, because that creates unemployment for unskilled workers, of which they are disproportionate. Second, get rid of welfare, because welfare, Charles Murray's book, Losing Ground, broke up the black family. I mean, slavery broke up the black family. There's this another analogy. If you put a frog in boiling water, the frog's metabolism is such that it jumps right out of it. Whereas if you put a frog in cold water and heat it up slowly, the frog stays there because it can't tell the slight variations, and then it gets boiled. Well, slavery was like boiling water. The black family was broken up during slavery because the mother was sold here, the father was sold there, the kids were sold there. But in the aftermath of slavery, the black family was fine. You had ads in all the papers in 1870, 1880, Mary, this is Joe, where are you? Let's get back together, you're my wife. I did some research in 1900, and not in 1900, but of 1900. I'm old, but not that old. And in 1910, and the black and the white family were just about as intact. The white families are 2% better off. But nowadays, 3/4 of black kids are from non-intact families, all due to welfare. So get rid of welfare, get rid of public housing, get rid of all sorts of unions that are bad for black people, all sorts of restrictions on entry. And, there are these black girls that do, black people have their hair in different ways than white people, braiding. And these young black girls are really good at braiding hair, and they're not allowed to do it. They get thrown in jail. So the way to solve the black problem of poverty, look, there are, the poverty rate for intact black families is in single digits. The whole black poverty problem is from non-intact families, which is due to LBJ's Great Society and welfare. So the way to solve the black problem is to have free enterprise. So instead of that, the Black Studies people and the Black Lives Matter people and all these progressives are saying, well, the way to solve the black problem is to have reparations. Nonsense. It's not really going to help them. They can't prove it. And even if you gave every black person $100,000, in 5 years, given the other crises of the black family, all that money would be dissipated. That's not going to help them. The way to help them is free enterprise, not giving them money. You give them money, and then they have less of an incentive to work hard. What's it? I think it was Amy Wax, or was it somebody? I forget her name. Said that the reason is they don't have bourgeois values. Even now, during the pandemic, why is it that black people are dying at a greater proportion than white people? Well, they're poor, and wealthier is healthier. They don't uphold the wearing of the mask as much. They're more obese, problems of obesity and problems of other health issues. So the solution for the black problem is not reparations. I would say that, with a great amount of certitude. The solution for the black problem is free enterprise. Let's have economic freedom, and then they'll be vastly improved. So I don't urge reparations, but when asked, I'm a deontological libertarian, and I have to try to promote libertarianism and to understand what libertarianism is all about. That's even more important, but both important. So what I'm trying to do is get to the outer edges of libertarianism, push my finger into the libertarian belly button and see what happens. And what happens is that reparations are justified. But that doesn't mean that if I became president and I wanted to solve the black problem, that the first thing I would do is start in with black reparations. It would be on the list, but way down at the bottom of the list.
What you say about the black family is true. When I was over in New Orleans a couple of years ago, when I came to your event, I went to a few jazz clubs, and all the jazz musicians were black, apart from the pianist, who was white. And I went on a walking tour around New Orleans, and I asked the tour guide, like, any idea why all the pianists are white and everyone else is black? He was like, well, it's probably because the piano is a more middle-class instrument, and the black middle class basically doesn't exist anymore in New Orleans, or at least not to the same extent it did historically. Which I thought, yeah, okay, that kind of makes sense, and that's certainly sort of kind of consistent with the Thomas Sowell's position, which is you've articulated quite well. So I thought that fit in quite nicely. So thank you for your time, Walter. If anyone would like to get more into your work on reparations or anything else, where's best to find it?
Just Google me, Walter Block, and I'm all over the place because I give a lot of interviews like this, and I published a lot. So just Google Walter Block, and you'll get something. What number are you up to on journal articles now? You're on an astonishing number. I can't remember what it is. I just passed 600. I'm around 610 or 615. And I'm heading off toward 1,000. I don't know if I'm going to make it, but I do about 20 a year, and I'm only 78. So if I keep going, maybe by the time I'm 100, I'll hit that.
Thank you for listening to Mindcrime. If you would like to provide any feedback on the show, including ideas for future discussions, we would love to hear from you. Please send emails to mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That is mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.